here. Does it seem like a good choice?
Yeah.
But April said, perhaps together we can. I was thinking it's been 40 years this spring since I first started speaking to a university audience. And for almost that whole time, my purpose in speaking has been to convey ideas and to ask people to see what I see. That is no longer, tonight, my main purpose. That's merely a means to an end. The end is, perhaps together, we can make a difference. None of us here are near the center of American power. So what does it take for people like us, who are not powerful, to make the effort to change the course of events in a powerful nation like ours? One thing it takes is a belief that it is possible. And the reason April introduced me in that way is that we wanted to expand your sense of what may be possible. Possible, for example, to strike a meaningful blow in the battle that's now going on in the American political arena. That is necessary because there is a battle going on, and it is not going nearly well enough. It is a battle in which the stakes could not be higher. What do we see in this time of crisis in America? I believe we see that on the political right, a once great political party has been taken over by a destructive force. And meanwhile, on the political left, what I'm calling liberal America, the response has been weak, inadequate, a failure to protect the nation from a destructive force. Now, I've spent a lot of time, and I intend probably to spend some more time, painting a picture of that destructive force. But my purpose here is not to focus on what has happened on the right, but to focus rather on what has not happened on the left. But I'll start with the first, because what has failed to happen on the left is a failure to see and a failure to stand up to what has arisen on the right. What we see on the right is a persistent insistence on making a fight over everything. Even ideas which originated in the Republican Party, they have combated once they've been proposed by the other side. War, politics as war, seems to be the bottom line rather than principle or policy. We see an insatiability when it comes to amassing of wealth and power. No such thing is enough. We now live in a time where the inequalities of wealth are greater than we've ever seen in living memory. And yet, the policies proposed by the Republicans would have the effect of widening that gap still further. I grew up in an America where we recognized that great inequalities of that sort were incompatible with democracy. I grew up in the 1950s when we were trying to spread democracy, and it was understood that the South American pattern was an obstacle to achieving what we wanted to achieve in terms of spreading democracy. It is a party, this force that is working through the Republican Party, is one that divides groups of people against each other. Almost all Americans have been agreed on the importance of taking steps to deal with the problem of joblessness in America today. Republicans have gained a considerable amount of power since 2010, and have certainly had the ability to work with or without others to help to create the jobs that Americans want. But instead have focused on issues which we have spent 40 years discovering are not bridgeable. There are differences that cannot be bridged. They set us against each other. It is a divide and conquer strategy, because if one half of America and another half of America are irreconcilably in battle, they cancel each other out. You cannot get a will of the people, and that clears the way for this insatiable force to impose its will. It's a force that preys upon the vulnerable while protecting the mightiest and richest. The corporate system whose burdens in taking care of the country have been reduced by 3/4 since Eisenhower was president, and whose share of the national wealth has increased and become more concentrated. While working to protect them, they take measures that afflict the most vulnerable. And their communications are so consistently dishonest. Now, what have we in Western civilization called things that insist upon conflict rather than peace, that prey upon the vulnerable and protect the privileged, that divide people against each other, and that are deceptive rather than honest in their communications? I'll stop there in terms of painting the portrait, though I'm writing a series of pieces to paint it in a variety of ways. That there is a rich picture that can be painted in terms of things that have happened in America in the last 10 or 12 years that are unprecedented in American history, to the best of my knowledge. And there's a way of looking also at some of the components that have made up this force, that have joined in the Koch brothers form of capitalism, which is willing to enrich itself beyond any practical purpose, even at the cost of the viability of the planet and the ability of our children and grandchildren and your children and grandchildren to have a comfortable or decent life, even endangering them. And there's a form of Christianity that has come together. And there's a right-wing media that has resulted, according to studies, in imbuing its followers with less knowledge of what's going on than people who have no sources of information. There are these ways of looking at what's happened. But let's look at what has not happened. Here we have something going on that our founders would have considered to be an enormous threat to the viability of the democracy they tried to set up. It's a force which is undermining our democratic system by substituting money for one man, one vote, one person, one vote. By disenfranchising groups of people simply for the sake of political partisan advantage. Lawlessness in the last presidency from that party. And it's trampling on our political traditions, like delegitimizing a president by spreading groundless lies about his having been born on another continent, by, again, disenfranchising voters, by using a filibuster. So here is that arising, this thing that we see in front of us every day. My purpose has been, my intellectual bent has been putting the pieces together. Well, when you put the pieces together, you see something which is really quite frightening and quite consistent in its destructiveness. And yet, the response has been so inadequate. The president that we elected in 2008 has been drained of his power without hardly standing up and fighting against that process. The Democratic Party that took control of the Congress in 2006 during the reign of the most lawless president in American history could not even rouse itself to censure, let alone what our founders had in mind when they put in the impeachment process. And the media and the Democratic Party treat this Republican Party, which is so different from the integrity of a Barry Goldwater or the decency of a Dwight Eisenhower, as if it were a normal, acceptable, respectable force. Well, why is that? Well, I think that there are a handful of reasons. And I'm going to go through three of them and then arrive at the fourth, which is one I want to emphasize. The first one is, I think, to the credit of the good, decent, liberal people that I know, which is they have no need for a life which consists of warfare. Well put together people are not eager for war. Broken people who have not managed to integrate themselves are only at home in a world in which there is black and white, in which people are, if the world outside them were harmonious, they would have to deal with what, unfortunately, they have found in their growing up that they cannot deal with. So you see, for example, with the rise of World War II, this brokenness, this insistence on conflict. And then in that case, the liberal democracies like Great Britain were reluctant to perceive what was happening because they did not want to go to war. And they had a legitimate excuse. They had buried the flower of their manhood just 10 or 15 years before that. What's our excuse? Well, the second reason is that this force, and again, I'm interested not in talking about the people on the other side. I see winds blowing through a cultural process, and people get caught up in what that wind is. So I'm not interested in demonizing any people, but I do want to call your attention to the rise of the demonic at the larger level that people get swept up in. My neighbors who vote for this party on a regular, habitual basis are good, decent people in every other aspect of their life that I'm aware of. They certainly make good neighbors. They make good people to deal with out there in the world in a business sense. They are intelligent, but caught up in a particular set of cultural forces, they become prone or prey to a force that can sweep them up. And part of that force has got to do with a certain kind of bullying energy. If you look at the dynamics between Democrats and Republicans, going back to 2002, when they were bullied about the authorization of force, and looking into, say, 2011, when there was an extortion to exact concessions in a completely un-American way over the debt ceiling. So that is not to the credit of liberal America, to be in the position of the bullied, unwilling to stand up because of being afraid of what the confrontation would mean. But we can see that. The third reason is, and I've encountered this for more than, well, I'd say about 20 years, a little more than 20 years, in conversations in liberal America, doing radio shows on Wisconsin Public Radio, and having conversations on the web, on my website. There is a belief in a set of values which is sort of inflexible, that peace is always the best option, that it is wrong to blame, it is wrong to pass judgment, that it is wrong to fight. Well, I have a long history myself of being that bridge builder that April talked about, and before that I worked for a group in Washington called Search for Common Ground. I believe in peace. But the world gives you different situations, and as April said, there are times for bridge building, and there are times for waging battle. And in liberal America, there are too many people who think that if you stand up and fight, you're just the same as the other side. They say that if you talk about what's going wrong on the other side, you're the same as Rush Limbaugh. I think there's a difference between those who fight with lies and those who fight with the truth. And there are times when you don't have the choice of being nice and everything being okay. Just as Britain didn't have that choice, though they tried to pretend that they did, until Churchill was vindicated and eventually became Prime Minister. You have a choice between having your future molded by the worst things that erupt out of civilization, or the choice of standing up and going into combat. Because unlike with the radio show I did with the fine people in the Shenandoah Valley, where we could talk to each other as if we might actually learn from each other, what we see now is a force where you can't come to common ground. They're not looking for common ground. We saw what they did when the proposal for an individual mandate that was a Republican idea that came out of the Heritage Foundation. You can't find common ground when you take their ground and they reject it. That's not what's going on. There is a force that has arisen, which is destructive. And there's a chance, and that leads us to the fourth reason, which is there is in the worldview of liberal intellectual America, and I don't mean in everybody, and I don't know how many of the people in this room, if any, it applies to. My guess is it applies some to some. But I certainly have encountered it. There is a belief that has arisen out of the scientific process that casts doubt on the essential reality and importance of the moral and spiritual dimension. There's a line from Yeats that I think captures the dynamic of our time. He speaks of a time when the best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with a passionate intensity. Now, I would say, and I've looked at this stuff, I mean, it's 10 years I've been looking at this stuff. I really deserve a Purple Heart, if not a Silver Cross. I don't know. The passion, what has happened on the right, with the good, decent people who are inflamed with this passionate intensity, I'm not calling them the worst. I mean, if I were to rewrite the line, I don't think of one group of people as being better or worse than the other, but they are under the influence of the worst. And I don't mean just the people like Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich and Karl Rove who have been lying, manipulative propagandists. I mean the worst in something harder to wrap your mind around, because the way the world works is really not just at the concrete level that we see. But they have been plugged into that human core where moral and spiritual passions are to be found. They believe that they are engaged in the battle between good and evil. And they believe that they are on the side of the good. I've watched how they have been enlisted in this. It is an educational process which has taken a generation. But they do believe that their basic spiritual commitments are endangered. Their basic moral values are threatened. Unfortunately, the threats against which they are protecting their genuine values are false. They're bogus. But they've shown where the passionate intensity is to be found. We can prevail only if we too are connected with that basic human core from which moral and spiritual passions come. I know that from the inside. I would have hung up my spikes, or whatever piece of equipment you hang up when you want to quit, a good while ago, if there wasn't a fire inside me, which will not let me do that. I'm going to be 68 next month. I do not need battle, but I do not feel it is okay for what I hold sacred to be torn apart, for this democracy to be turned into a plutocracy, for this planet that is threatened to be allowed to go down the tubes so that we have disruption of the processes upon which human life and the rest of life on earth depends. My well-being is not important enough where the sacred is at stake. And that's why I'm here. But people have gotten to this position where they don't see that there can be something like that having arisen in our world that's as dark and ugly as this. And they don't see that could be such a thing as the sacred values that we need to protect because they are more important than anything having to do with our own individual comfort. And they don't see that there can be any meaningful way of talking about the battle between good and evil. And that's where some of the intellectual currents at work in our society have to be confronted. So part of what I want to confront is actually a worldview. A lot of people on the right are still embedded in the religious traditions of our civilization, which answer some very fundamental questions and give people avenues into understanding a fundamental aspect of the human system, the stakes. We have a system, we have a tradition in which there have been prophets that have arisen and spoken passionately, even at the cost of their own lives sometimes, to evil power. There is a sense that there are things that are simply just too important but we have had an intellectual revolution in the Western world, starting with wherever you want to draw the line, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Darwin. Great minds have started to develop a way of thinking to arrive at beliefs, not through received texts that tell you how it all started, what it all means, what's required. And I am actually in that tradition. My dad called himself a child of the Enlightenment. Not in the Zen sense, but in the sense that our founding fathers were children of the Enlightenment. The belief in reason. You arrive at your beliefs through evidence. Out of that tradition, there's become some intellectual currents that say, well, there aren't anything, there's no real values. Values are not really real. What's real is what's objective. It's out there. It's measurable. If you can't find it out there, well, then it's just subjective. And if it's subjective, it's just a matter of opinion. And if it's just a matter of opinion, well, I taught students in the 1970s, and for a few years, and I taught students in a decade ago. And in both cases, I found a lot of my students having absorbed, not by having thought through all the stuff from the logical positivists and things like that, where people were in a disciplined and sometimes brilliant fashion trying to deal with what science had left us with when people abandoned the religious tradition. And some of them were actually embedded in the religious tradition, but they absorbed from the culture the idea that, well, values aren't quite real. So I would have a student say something to me. I love to use this line because it captures so much. Well, what the Nazis did at Auschwitz isn't what I would have done. But it was in accordance with their values, and so it was right for that. Well, if values are just a matter of opinion, then there's no standpoint from which you can say, well, what the values of the Nazis were acting upon when they exterminated the people was not as good as the values that are embodied in the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount or in the Bill of Rights. But there is that current. And I know that my liberal friends, none of them don't have values. But if you've got a shadow hanging over your values that you don't really entirely believe that they're real, how are you going to rouse yourself for the idea that there is sometimes in the human drama where there is something going on which is best understood as the battle between good and evil? Well, I know that the idea of evil is one that is not held in good repute in large segments of liberal America. Not a legitimate concept. Doesn't really apply to anything that's real in the world. Now, there's a saying in baseball, you can't hit what you can't see. And I think it's true in this situation too. Plus, you can't see what you don't believe can exist. And that's fairly well established too. We all know how to respond to an evil force. By the way, would you raise your hand if hearing me say something like an evil force to try to get you to see the true nature of something that we are dealing with in America today? Would you raise your hand if you're comfortable with that language? We know how to respond to an evil force because it is one of the major motifs of our imaginative life. Now, I choose 3 films to illustrate that because, well, first of all, I like them. Secondly, they are big in the culture. They didn't just come and go. One of them is Avatar. April, would you be so kind as to bring me that water bottle? I expected to be standing within reach of it. I'm getting drier by the moment. The human creature has needs that are not relative. They are built into the creature. One of them is the need for hydration. It's not the most important need, but none of the others are going to come into play if you completely neglect that.
That's true.
In Avatar, we see a force which you could call a military-industrial complex that is at work in a living planet and willing to destroy its inhabitants and the integrity of its web of life in order to obtain unobtainium, a mineral of great value. Value in a certain military economic sense. I don't think they ever tell us exactly what it's good for, but it's very valuable. And we go into that world with our protagonist, who is an American soldier, who I think tellingly has lost the use of his legs in that world, but by virtue of the ability to transform him into the shape of the natives, enters their world and gradually sees a contrast between 2 different visions of life. One of which has integrity and a sense of the sacred, and one of which is governed by an insatiable greed, unhindered by scruple, and willing to use the tools of brutality. If that isn't good versus evil, and we, along with our protagonist, enter into that dynamic willingly. We know how to respond because we are happy to be put through our paces to see the lines drawn between these 2 great forces amassed against each other. The force of the sacred, these little floating things that land on our hero, that show he is one of the chosen ones, even though he's a bit of a jerk, like she says, the blue girl. And we join with them in their passion to preserve the world that we've seen the beauty of, the integrity of. We've seen that this isn't just about what can I get for me, but it's an interdependent web. This is what we depend on every moment that we breathe, every meal that we eat. That is what life has created in 3.5 billion years. And you can tell from our brains that we are going through all of that. You can tell from our endocrine system. We are being mobilized for battle. We participate in the battle. And we are gratified when good triumphs over evil. Second movie, Star Wars. We've got these guys and a gal, and a few droids, who are made of the stuff of life, fully human and full of that richness that we all strive for in our lives, and the reality of things. And we've got, well, first we encounter these men encased in plastic and all look exactly alike. I mean, they might as well be machines for all the humanity that they're allowed to show. We don't even get to see their faces. But they're not the issue. We've got the Empire. We've got the Death Star. We've got a force that's willing to destroy a living planet to get what it wants out of the princess. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi says, there's been a disturbance in the Force. Because, again, we are living in an interconnected thing. He's tuned in on that. And we join with Luke, who goes from the beginning, where he's this sort of adolescent, restless adolescent, somewhat immature guy, to the guy who's ready to help save what's sacred in his world. He trusts the Force. He threads his bomb down that little tube into the middle of the Death Star and harnesses the force of the Death Star to destroy it. And we go through all that. We know how to respond to an evil force. We respond like Luke did. And then there's Lord of the Rings. April and I know what it's like to be hobbits. We love our little place. We like to sit and sip coffee together or sit on the deck and watch the sunset in our little hobbit lives, our little kitty cat on one of our laps. We all like that comfort. But we know how to respond to an evil force, the force a ring that is so seductive, it's so tied in with lust for power that nobody can hold it in their hand without being contaminated. And we know that in order to preserve the world, we can't let the force that's wanting this to be able to dominate the whole cosmos. So all the things that they do to save the world, we do vicariously with Frodo and his friends. Now, why don't we do the same thing? We are really up against the same thing as Sully in Avatar. We've got people out there plundering the planet, willing to sacrifice the web of life, billionaires who are probably going to go a long way to dictating what our next Congress is going to look like, who are willing to spread disinformation to get more money for themselves, so they already have more than you could spend in a lifetime, or your children, or your grandchildren, at the sacrifice of the integrity of the biosphere on this planet, which has taken a long time to put together. We know what Sully was up against. Why aren't we acting like Sully? We're up against the same thing as Luke. We know what the lust for power looks like. We watched the president, who was the most powerful person in the world, sweep aside the balance, the division, what's it called? Checks and balances that our founders gave us. Usurp powers, lie us into a war, torture from the highest level for the first time in American history, stiff-arm the Congress, try to avoid the courts. I mean, if you're the most powerful person in the world, isn't that enough? Well, we know what Luke was up against. Why aren't we responding like Luke? We're up against the same thing as Frodo in some ways. We see that good people can be seduced by, metaphorically speaking, the emanations from a kind of dark and destructive ring into working hard in the belief that they're serving the good when they've been seduced into doing just the opposite. We know how Frodo responded to that kind of a threat. Why aren't we acting like Frodo? Well, I'll tell you what my take on it is. I mean, in addition to the fact that you got to get a college degree, you got to pay the bills, you got to make a living, you got aches and pains. In addition to that, all these things that we willingly go to are in imaginary worlds. They put us through our paces and we're willing to do it because we're willing to suspend disbelief. That's one of the important words when people talk about literary criticism and theater and other forms of artistic communication. We suspend disbelief. We believe that Obi-Wan Kenobi discerns a disturbance in the Force. We believe that there's something sacred tree that puts out these little sparkly Tinkerbells that land on Sully's shoulders. We're happy to believe those. But then, in the real world, we don't suspend disbelief. We are operating within our beliefs. And again, if you don't believe that there's such a thing as an evil force, well, you don't see it. You don't mobilize like those heroes. And like we do when we identify with those heroes, to fight it. Now, I've been working on trying to see things whole for half a century. These numbers are frightening to say, but there it is. And I think that the belief that intellectual responsibility requires us to come to those conclusions is fallacious. We don't have to get, we have to get to where traditional religions have taken us. And those in the audience who get there by those means, I got no desire to rock anybody's boat. My dad was a child of the Enlightenment. That's how I was brought up, and what I believe in. I'm not going to ever say, well, whatever science says, I'm not going to believe it. You know, that's just not in my repertoire. There may be, but I don't think that coming to our beliefs by virtue of what my dad taught as the methods of intellectual responsibility, evidence looked at honestly, without foregone conclusions, conclusions coming from the evidence processed by reason, rather than conclusions coming first and then finding arguments to justify it. That's how I was brought up. I don't believe it leads us to the conclusions that I see embedded in liberal America. I think it's a fallacy to say there are no values. I've been looking at things in an evolutionary perspective since I was, I don't know, I think I first started seriously working on it about the age of 16. In an evolutionary perspective, value is real. It comes into the cosmos, not as, I mean, I don't know where it all came from, Big Bang-wise or whatever, but just from what science shows. It shows it seems to be a lifeless universe for a very long time. But then out of it, just because, well, that's what happens, those things which emerge, which are capable of perpetuating themselves, spread. Those things which cannot perpetuate themselves don't. And some of them, by chance, mutation, reproduction, it took a long time to create a one-celled creature. I think that most of the history of life is one-celled creatures. It took a long time to make something so ordered and so perfect in a way, all the way down to the molecular level. That's quite an achievement. And it took a long time to create a biosphere with the climate and the movement of energy and oxygen and nitrogen and all those things which keep on going in the absence of some kind of intrusion from the non-living system, like an asteroid hitting the planet, or volcanic eruptions, or continents floating together. I mean, it's not like it's been a bumpy ride, but that's because life is only capable of controlling so much. But so there's a concept of emergence, which is before a certain point, things are behaving, following certain rules, physics, particle physics, quantum mechanics, chemistry, and then life. Life happened. And the system itself seemed to have a choice, in a sense, a preference. But this, metaphorically speaking, there is a preference for life and what can spread itself over death. That's how we got to be this way, according to evolution. Everything about us is because the things that didn't work didn't shape the future. The things that did. And there was a long time to do the job. Value comes out of that process then, evolutionary speaking, intellectually responsibly speaking. Value comes out because part of the way that life found to perpetuate itself was to create creatures, us, but not only us, who experience that things matter. When I'm thirsty, my body is telling me, you got to pay attention to this. I didn't mean to do that. You got to pay attention to this because all those generations before us, those forms that didn't have that response of, oh, I better rehydrate myself, better get something to eat, better get a hold of that girl, did not perpetuate itself. And we were built into us was a sense of value. This is good because, well, we don't say because, but our organism tells us it's good, and the reason our organism tells us it's good is because it's associated with life and right over death. And if I drop a milk bottle on my big toe, that feels bad. I definitely think there's a greater value to eating good food rather than dropping a milk bottle on my toe. And my cat has similar attitudes. She thinks it's really nice to be petted. She thinks it's really good to be fed. She likes a warm spot over the heating grate. This is value. And it is not out there, but it is not just opinion, any more than our anatomy. Every face that's looking at me has a nose in the middle of it. Is that idiosyncratic because it's there? To say that value is not real is essentially the equivalent of saying that pain is not real. The only place that value could matter is in the